This is projecting well, I think. Okay. Welcome to the plenary panel on trends and futures in STS. This year's panel differs from some of the plenary sessions we've had in recent past. Recent sessions have been devoted to conference themes or recalling significant developments in past years that were important for what STS has become today. This conference has no official theme, though the sub rosa theme is zombies and other monsters, for reasons to be explained and demonstrated at the banquet. I had thoughts of having a plenary on zombie banks, undead sciences, and the ubiquitous monsters in our field, but that didn't seem very edifying. Wiser heads persuaded me that we don't want to have any association with zombie ideas and sciences that remain on the shelf, or on the shelf well past their sell-by date. So instead, we're going to be doing the opposite, discussing what is very much alive, promising, and perhaps also problematic, in directions the field seems to be headed. To join me on a panel discussion of trends and futures, I'm pleased that we have our incoming president, Judy Weissman, and two highly distinguished former 4S presidents who remain very much at the forefront of our field, Sheila Jasanoff and Kara Nor-Satina. Given the fact that all of us have been involved in studies of science, technology, and related topics for decades, inevitably our sense of prospect will be informed by retrospection. This kind of panel can, of course, be quite deadly, no pun intended, if it encourages ponderous pronouncements on whither STS, and I think we're all savvy enough to realize that the field will go where it goes, regardless of where those of us on the podium happen to think it should head. However, we can make suggestions and observations to think about. And perhaps plant a seed idea or two, and so each of us will be giving a brief talk to outline our own views and visions, but the panel discussion also is designed to allow plenty of time for questions in the session. I don't think everybody in this room will get to ask a question, certainly not get an answer, but we will do what we can. We have 2 hours allocated for the session, now 20 minutes in, but we're going to try to end around 20 or 30 minutes early to give some of us time to catch our breath before the business meeting and to allow ample time for getting costumes ready for the banquet. And there will be a business meeting for those who want to know what's going on with this association after at 6 o'clock. Now, before we begin, I'd like to have us to take a moment to remember Olga Amsterdamska, who died on August 27th of this year. Normally, we would do this at the banquet, but given this year's Halloweenish theme, I think it would be more fitting and certainly more tasteful to remember Olga here. Now, Olga was perhaps best known to members of this society as a notable editor of Science, Technology, and Human Values from 1994 to 1998. These were key years in the development of the journal, after it became the official 4S journal. She also was co-editor of the STS handbook published in 2007, and despite becoming seriously ill during the editing process, she kept up her part of it, even phoning from a hospital bed for a conference call with the other editors. She also had her own very well-regarded research programs on the history of linguistics and more recently on the history of epidemiology and biomedicine. Though she had a sharp, critical mind, exemplified by her hard-hitting review of Bruno Latour's Science in Action, which was published in Science, Technology, and Human Values before she was an editor. She was a fair-minded and an outstanding editor. Above all, she was a fine person who gave a lot to the society and was much admired by many of us. Please join me in a moment of silence for Olga Amsterdamska. Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, now each of us is going to give a 10 to 15 minute talk, and again, this is designed as a panel rather than a presentation of research. And again, the theme is on futures and prospects, promising trends in research. The order of the program will be me, Michael Lynch, Kara Norsatina, Judy Weissman, and then Sheila Jasanoff. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to start forthwith. I have a talk that is entitled, Whatever Happened to Symmetry? Now that title suggests a backward-looking focus, but actually I intend to address current trends in STS. Before launching into this brief account, I should mention that the vital signs indicate that STS is robust, growing, spreading, and gaining recognition beyond the boundaries of this association. And you can see we need a big room to contain those of you here. There's over 900 people registered for this meeting. STS now has its own history and a sizable literature, which the latest studies frequently cite as grounds for general arguments about the construction of science and technology. It should be obvious from this conference that STS is bursting with different and sometimes contrary intellectual histories and tendencies. However, I think that if many of us were asked to tell a history, not according to our own preferences, but instead according to what we would imagine most others in the field would say, we'd mention that a key break occurred in the 1970s, centered at the Science Studies Unit at the University of Edinburgh, and connected with a broader, self-exemplifying Kuhnian revolution in history and philosophy of science. To reduce the STS variant of this revolution to its barest minimum, it is common to cite David Bloor's list of postulates for the strong program: causality, impartiality, reflexivity, and symmetry, which together make up his proposal to give social or social historical explanations of scientific conduct and its technical products. To reduce even further, impartiality is often folded into symmetry, which becomes the iconic term for the entire scheme. Bloor proposes that his program, and I quote, would be impartial with respect to truth or falsity, rationality or irrationality, success or failure. Both sides of these dichotomies will require explanation. And he continues, it would be symmetrical in its style of explanation. The same types of cause would explain, say, true and false beliefs. Both impartiality and symmetry express the aim to move sociology of science beyond what Bloor called the sociology of error, in order to emphasize true as well as false knowledge/belief. Symmetry was debated from the outset, and for many years afterwards, from a number of different angles. It was doubled or redoubled by proponents of actor network theory and treated as a topic of heightened critical interest in feminist standpoint theory. I think it's fair to say that while it is not universally accepted as a founding principle in the broader fields of history, philosophy, and social studies of science, or even fully embraced by card-carrying 4S members, it is widely invoked and even presupposed by much of the work that rides under the STS banner, particularly work that identifies itself as constructivist, with or without the crossed-out social. One recent trend in STS that I've noticed is that symmetry, considered in a broad, almost iconic sense, has been black-boxed, except in occasional polemics involving philosophers or others who challenge what they see to be a fundamental relativistic assumption. For the most part, in writings that identify with STS, symmetry has been tucked into a sense of confidence with which we invoke the field as a platform for presenting descriptions, arguments, and normative prescriptions. At the same time, I would argue much, perhaps most, of the research in STS today seems to owe very little to symmetry. For the past couple of decades, the predominant trend has been toward political and moral engagement with normative and often emancipatory agendas. Proponents of STS advocate global public engagement in debates about technoscience governance and democratizing expertise, and in some cases even using STS to authorize a form of expertise. Sometimes symmetry is explicitly repudiated, but more often it is ignored or even presumed without discussion. Symmetry is sometimes wrongly, in my opinion, conflated with value neutrality, but frequently it is invoked or implied as a leveling strategy that prepares the ground for normative ambitions that would reach into the very heart of technical debates. It is though symmetrical STS has softened up the sciences so that social scientists, humanists, and a broader public can now march in with confidence to scrutinize and criticize science in general or take apart particular arguments or facts authorized by science. In such cases, symmetry has a strategic role, a role that is rhetorically effective precisely because it remains unexamined. At the risk of opening up tired arguments, I recommend that we should rethink symmetry, or at least rethink what it has become. There won't be time to set out exactly how I think we should do this, and I'm still trying to work that out for myself. However, I am not suggesting that we should abandon the idea of symmetry as miscast or outmoded. Instead, I believe there is reason to rethink what symmetry can possibly mean for work in STS today. I didn't have the first, and I don't expect to have the last word on the subject, but in my view, symmetry makes most sense when it is understood in a funny kind of way, technically, as an initial move that opens up a prospect for a particular kind of discovery. What I'm recommending is a deflationary view of symmetry as a limited curricular position, rather than an intellectual foundation for a comprehensive epistemology, ontology, or ethical worldview. In this view, symmetry provides an orientation with which to begin particular studies of the sciences and of the uses of science and technology. As a curricular orientation, it leaves a large amount of room for extracurricular judgments about what is true, sincere, trustworthy, reasonable, ethical, politically acceptable or not. But it also fosters an orientation that is quite distinctive and potentially revealing. Viewed in this way, symmetry is bound to disappoint aspirations for using STS research as a basis for effectively engaging and intervening in what Viva Biker, in an earlier talk, called the big issues of social order, international peace, local and social security, national and religious identity, and democracy. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying or suggesting that we should turn away from the world and hole up in the ivory tower as if it ever existed. I'm not saying that we can't express opinions about, develop insights into, or make recommendations about practical and political matters ranging from global climate change, reproductive rights, corporate influence on pharmaceutical research, and endlessly many other topics and difficult problems. Nor am I arguing that sustained research on such problems and controversies is not valuable, both for forming or deepening our own understandings and communicating them to others. Instead, what I'm saying is that symmetry is as a postulate, or STS as a corporate authority and agent, is far less significant for engagement in practical politics than what we bring to the table from our extracurricular experience and what we learn substantively by conducting research on specific historical and contemporary controversies and problems. Adhering to symmetry can actually be counterproductive if treated instrumentally as a source of leverage for intervening in public discussions. In polarized political and legal situations, academic advice tends to be grossly simplified in production or in effect to accord with one or another already hardened party position. Symmetry and other tendencies associated with STS tend to complicate simple questions and statements by bringing their circumstances into the foreground. When treated as a skeptical position, constructivist STS might seem useful for undermining scientific authority and critiquing pronouncements about inevitable technological futures. But as we have seen recently, such argumentative moves are by no means monopolized by STS spokespersons, and they are not necessarily useful only for purpose of democratizing science and technology. In terms of the deflationary view I'm recommending, symmetry is not a very useful tool for leveling the playing field and promoting the democratization of science. But this does not mean that it has no value for STS. Earlier I mentioned that it can be valuable as an orientation to discovery. When initially proposed, symmetry encouraged investigations. It was not an epistemological position to the effect that all science is uncertain and that all truth claims about nature should be put in scare quotes. Nor was it a methodological warrant for unprejudiced descriptions. Instead, it was more of an effort to awaken sensibility to what has been taken for granted as just so. The most familiar way to do this was to open up the black box of naturalistic or mathematical propositions to discover the hidden social, political, and cultural embeddedness and mediation. However, I think another way to view symmetry is pertinent at a time when government and corporate agents, instead of, or in addition to, enrolling the authority of naturalistic arguments, attempt to foster what Bruno Latour called artificially maintained scientific controversy. Rather than viewing symmetry as a license to unmask political agendas hidden by naturalistic claims, it seems more pertinent to treat such unmasking symmetrically as a constitutive phenomenon, a topic rather than a resource, to use a familiar ethnomethodological distinction. And consistent with the original symmetry and impartiality postulates, the aim would not be to demarcate artificially maintained from real controversy, or to borrow Maya Horst and Alan Irwin's wretched pun, real from false consensusness. Instead, to close with the paradox, the aim would be to add another distinction to Bloor's impartiality postulate. The discovery program would be impartial with respect to truth or falsity, rationality or irrationality, success or failure, and symmetry or asymmetry. Both sides of these dichotomies will require explanation. Thank you. Okay, we're going to hold questions until the end, and our next speaker is Karen Norris-Satina.
Thank you. I cannot do without PowerPoints, even though they are very inadequate for this setting. Thank you, Mike, for inviting me to this panel. It was very flattering, but it was also, admittedly, very disconcerting. I don't particularly know what to say about the future of STS. I certainly don't want to pontificate on the field. I don't want to extrapolate my own work here, because you may hold me accountable for actually doing it, and I may not want to do that. And the field is doing what it does. As Michael said, it's like a market in Hayek's sense. Everyone has their own best local and past knowledge and brings it to bear on the choices they make. So I thought in the end I will have only one little thing to say, and I will do a little daydreaming. I will imagine what I would do if someone, it's Halloween, gave me a treat, the money to create a Center for Science and Technology Studies, $10 million a year, 10 years. But before I go into that, let me start with a perception. I feel, as a field, we are happy among ourselves, but fragmented. It may be useful to compare us with anthropology, with which we have a number of things in common. Ethnography is not the least of them. But we don't have everything in common with anthropology. Anthropology has been shaken by various waves of critique and soul-searching, colonialism, whiting culture, reflexivity, and it has lost or is losing its small-scale tribal societies. It has also freely given away its nice concept of culture to cultural studies, to literature, to anyone else who came along and wanted it. Anthropology doesn't seem to want it anymore. It now shares the society it studies, which have become very complex or integrated in complex societies, with other fields, with sociology, with ethnicity studies, and so on. And it develops and uses concepts which it also shares with everyone else, Foucault's concepts, for example. I think, we have several advantages compared with anthropology. It's a good comparison for us, and they should be noted. First, we are not losing our previous subject, science and technology. It rather keeps expanding. It continues to be on the way up and out to everywhere where it is not. And some reflexive understanding of this most articulated and perhaps most powerful system of the contemporary world will surely be needed for a long time. There is no danger, I think, that we will lose our original subject matter, though we may get some stiffer competition from other areas, for example, economics, which has paid increasing attention to science, stimulated by policy's attention to a knowledge economy and innovation. Well, we are also not in danger of losing a central concept because we have none. We are sharing our concepts with others, but where we share them, we seem to be on the generative and creative side, the inventors and not the imitators, and that's nice, I think. But what we do share with anthropology is a certain fragmentation as a discipline, of which sociology, being much more of a normal science discipline, with which sociology is not that affected, I think. Science, we also share, I think, with anthropology a disinclination to study our own institutions and culture in other ways than on the writing level, and to draw consequences from that study. Science and technology students have not made a strong attempt to think outside the box when it comes to how our institutions should be constructed. On the contrary, it seems that when we are able to have a department or a program or a committee or whatever these units are called within the legitimating framework of a university, we make a pronounced attempt to reproduce all the structures traditional disciplines have: the reward system, the tenure structure, curricular teaching, recruitment, student admission, are all set up pretty much, if not exactly, as they are set up anywhere else. Now, if a benevolent creature gave me a grant of 10 million a year to set up a center for science and technology studies, I would look into some of these issues, but I would also add some other things. Here is the center, by the way. And it's located in California. Silicon Valley, more precisely. I know exactly where I want to put it. Are there any grant agency representatives here? First, I will expand in such a center, I will expand the methodological framework used at the center, and I would not have us do single case studies, but would replace these by collaborative studies that focus on historical or contemporary development in some depth and breadth. So instead of one ethnographer working on a particular controversy, I would have several ethnographers and other analysts working on a set of controversies comparatively. Instead of one historian working on a particular war and its technology, I would have a group of historians and others drawing on dozens of such conflicts to come up with somewhat systematic conclusions about technology and its role in insurgencies, terrorism, long and short wars, and so on. I believe that there are some more general and systematic lessons to be learned from such comparative and collaborative studies, and historians, for example, the group that recently wrote about counterinsurgency movement and created a manual for general betrayers that concluded you have to win over the general population in order to win over counterinsurgents, actually started to do just that. So this is what I will do on the general methodology side. On the question of what exactly we will do at that center, that's a tougher issue. but I have come up with some proposals. The first line of research would, of course, have to focus on laboratories. And it will do comparative ethnographic and contemporary history studies of laboratory interdisciplines. That is, I would focus on a particular branch of science, those multidisciplinary and multivalent, as some have called them, fields that have emerged increasingly and seemingly naturally, not induced by funding agencies in the last years. Relevant fields could be psychobioimmunology, as one of them is called, nanotechnology, neuroeconomy, neuropolitics, and neuropsychology, neurosociology, neuroeverything. Even behavioral economics could be a candidate. The interesting question, I think, would be the combinatorial logic of such fields. If science and technology are marked by epistemic cultures, then fields that negotiate and interrelate several cultures, if they do, should tell us quite a bit about the creation of new epistemic practices and conditions of interdisciplinarity particularly. Are trading zones involved? Do boundary objects play a role? Is one discipline recruiting and acquiring others? What conceptual model of such a murder is adequate? What about the processes of hybridization, conflicts implicated in the process, and so on? Such a focus would have the advantage of simultaneously targeting new development in science and bringing to bear traditional unblackboxing methods. My second line of research, in nanoscience itself, you could do several of these studies, for example. My second line of research could focus on explanatory cultures. It will again be done comparatively, choosing, for example, a theoretical natural science, a social science, and perhaps a public area such as the one studied by Sheila Jasanoff and Mike Lynch. Theory and explanation, as you know, has hardly been studied by STS at all. But explanatory tropes, how objects are constructed and then linked to particular causes, or to put it in softer terms, how the world is made sense of, should be quite relevant to understandings of these fields. It's interesting that in social science you find very descriptive concepts and explanatory strategies that draw on particular distinctions, for example, between surface and deep structure. Religious belief overrule economic and political interest, that's Huntington, they are deeper seated. Power breeds counterpower, demarcation leads to conflict, gaps become filled, a weakening of the nation state leads to re-secularization, and things of that sort. Physics, I think, has very different explanatory strategies. Theories are functions. They can be manipulated, combined, averaged, interwoven with simulation and with data. And any inconsistencies may actually lead to the postulation of new phenomena, even if these phenomena are not visible, like in the case of black holes and missing masses. And the concepts appear far removed from the descriptive level of empirical research, counterintuitive and extreme. I have to move on, he's already looking at me. A third possibility would be to not look at explanatory cultures, but to look at what Michelle Lamont is looking at in her new books, evaluative cultures, but to do that comparatively across, again, various areas, not only in the area of the social sciences and grant proposals, but for example also in the area of finance, where rating agency evaluations are a wonderful example, and McKinsey is starting to look at that, a wonderful example of an evaluative culture gone awry, and it works quite differently from how we work in grant panels. The nice thing about that is that the case of rating agencies shows that a quantitative evaluative culture is no better than a qualitative one. So we should take courage from that, I think. One more example, and I'm getting to the last one. One more example of what I would like to study is field mechanisms. These are collective mechanisms that play a role on the level of the whole field and that are not located on the level of research, but rather on the level of the kind of institutions and conventions a field has. Authorship conventions, for example, vary radically between different fields. This is an example of physics. They vary radically, and depending on what they are like, they send the field off in a particular direction. There are other mechanisms of that kind. For example, the degree of laboratorization in a particular field is something that could be related to organizational sociology in sociology and to even transaction cost theory in economics, would lead to some cross-fertilization between these disciplines, all of which know something about organizing work, but would also teach these disciplines what we know on the science side about laboratories. I have 1 minute left. I would like to add to the things I've already put up there a Science and Society Media Lab. That would be a thing that observes what goes on in science and society, a sort of science scope or observatory. But the crux of this media lab would really be that it is engaged in media creation and application in the area of actual science processes, not the sort of thing that shows you a particular finding and explains that finding, the sort of thing that we have in science shows on the radio and on TV, but rather the sort of thing that draws on the findings we have in science studies and tries to exhibit them, to create artifacts around them, and to create artistic designs around them that could then be shown to the public or could become an iPod application. So here is a dream. The dream, as you see, has one particular basic assumption. We should move toward larger time scale, broader case range, comparative style studies, in which we should include, where appropriate, quantitative indicators, though we shouldn't use these for the sort of in-depth epistemic investigations we might also do. I think if a fairy gave me the money, we could do all this kind of research without losing our original focus, knowledge, or methodology. But we could potentially gain much, including in understanding of the institutional setup of the sciences and in power, because many of these things would actually be sellable to the political side and to other fields. Thank you very much. Yep. I think I have it under control. Yes.
Take it off.
Take it off? Okay.
What do I do? No, this was my punchline, my joke, you know.
I can't make it dark anymore.
I was seconds away from covering it up. I'm sorry.
Never mind.
All right, so it'll come back. They'll probably have to. Okay.
Oh, you're going to introduce me?
Yeah, I'm going to introduce.
You are? Yes, sorry.
Okay, our next speaker and our next president is Judy Weissman.
Thanks very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm extraordinarily proud to be the next president of 4S, sitting with such a distinguished group of my predecessors. It's great to take over from Mike, who's leaving things in such good nick, but actually who wants to take over from a workaholic? It's not, it's the contrast will be shocking, I'm sure. And we have got very different styles, but it's great to be taking over. But I have to say that I am not yet president, and I'm going to have plenty of time to give you long speeches over the next couple of years. So I am really going to be rather short. So just a few brief reflections, and we were hoping to provoke you into lots of responses rather than questions in the time we've got left, so we are trying to keep short. Firstly, I just want to recall some recent occasions when I really beamed with pride for being part of STS. I hope this doesn't sound too schmaltzy, but one I have to say was being at the American Sociological Association last August, and I was standing with my handbook co-editor Ed Hackett, watching Steve Epstein receive the book prize for his book Inclusion, The Politics of Difference in Medical Research. So it was a very nice moment for us. Another, I must say, is living in London during the financial crisis, and I have to say that I changed countries at exactly the wrong time, because actually the Australian economy is in fantastic shape, so I'm the only person who travelled the wrong way. But lots of people comment to me about the wonderful work that's going on in STS on finance. For example, Donald Mackenzie's articles on hedge funds that appeared in the London Review of Books that really has a very wide readership. And all I can say is that I wish I'd had the genius to pick the research area that would be the topic of the century. And I think that the same can be said about our long-standing STS work on the environment and climate change, as well as on biomedical technologies and genomics. And so I really always do feel that we have our kind of finger on the pulse. We're at the cutting edge, a great place to be. So much so that I was really pleased, if you'll allow me a very kind of British moment, that when our research assessment exercise report came out, one of the things it said is that the sociology of science had really invigorated British sociology. In fact, to quote, "From being a rather narrow specialist area, the sociology of science has become a mainstream part of British sociology." So that was also a nice moment. When I ran for 4S president, I was a full-time research professor at the Australian National University and a very thoughtful person, had lots of time to read books with parrots and sunshine and all sorts of things. And now I'm head of the sociology department at the London School of Economics, and I feel I can hardly see past my nose. I'm very aware that we're an international association and that I can only read part of the vast literature that we're producing, the English part, and I'm sure that will be even clearer to me next year when we're in Japan. But my own location now is in London, so forgive me if my comments kind of reflect that kind of parochialism. Although I guess I shouldn't kind of apologise too much, because after all, one of STS's truisms is that all knowledge is indeed local, situated and contingent, and so is mine. My experience of late leads me to believe that because we are so cutting edge, people either ignore us, and I think a lot of people don't know about us, and some of the sessions certainly I went to, for example, at the American Sociological Association, I did feel like we didn't exist, that people didn't know about our work. But I also think alternatively that some writers now position themselves in relation to us, often caricaturing our position as if we all shared one unified position anyway. And often how this comes about is in the form of people defending technological determinism, kind of against us as the kind of straw person. And for example, a recent critic of my work writes, to quote, "Wiseman, like many others in STS," I wouldn't have minded actually if it was just Wiseman, it was the like many others in STS that got me, quote, "See technological determinism as something unmentionable, a kind of prescribed thought crime, a dark and hidden undercurrent that occasionally betrays itself in the careless writings of some social theorists." And reading this, I did rather despair, I have to say. And then I recalled Sally Wyatt's essay on technological determinism in our 4S handbook. where she says that STSs can't simply despair at the endurance of technological determinism and wait for the world to embrace the indeterminacy and complexity of our accounts. Rather, we need to understand the purposes for which it is used by social actors in specific circumstances. I mean, her provocation in the essay is to say, to quote, "Our guilty secret in STS is that really we are all technological determinists." Now, I don't go along with that line, but I do think that she's right to caution us that to ignore the justificatory technological determinism of so many actors is like ignoring the equivalent of a thundering herd of elephants. And I think that the fact that this issue keeps coming up again and again and kind of won't go away does tell us something about the power of technology in our dreams and visions of the future, and about the power of the industry and media and such like. In The Guardian last week, for example, in Britain, there was a commentary on the fact that the word iPhone confers instant coolness and connectedness. And the article went on to say that it's now impossible to read a newspaper without coming across a story about the iPhone. Indeed, it had counted 143 mentions of the iPhone in national newspapers over the previous week. So I'm really pleased that one of the areas, and it's well represented at this conference actually, is the kind of developing area of the dynamics of expectations, which is exploring the ways in which patterns of hope, promises and hype help construct the future as a resource to shape innovation in the present. Such expectations are performative in the way they mobilise the future into the present, and it's made me much more aware of how our own studies, and science studies as well, participate in the making of the socio-technical future. Now, as head of the Department of Sociology that has a major research centre on biomedicines, BIOS, I've been thinking afresh about the relationship between sociology and STS. And in order to do this, I reread an article by John Law on sociology and STS that was in last year's Sociological Review. And I love reading John Law's articles because they're incredibly stimulating, but I always find them incredibly infuriating, and so they're exactly what essays should be. And I must confess that I similarly tend to write essays in this mode, that is, of taking the perspective of arguing that sociology should learn this or that from STS. And I was quite struck when Karen commented to me at the ASA, well, STS could learn from sociology too. So let me just take up a few points that John makes in his essay, and if he was here, he'd no doubt have quite a lot to say about how I'm performing in relation to kind of his arguments. Firstly is our focus on materiality, which he puts very well and which I entirely agree with. I'm really struck by how increasing consciousness of climate change, for example, is really bringing these issues to the fore. I recently heard a fascinating lecture at the LSE by Tim Mitchell on the politics of oil that was very much adopting an STS perspective on no longer seeing oil or its supply as simply a natural fact to be scientifically assessed. And I was sitting with my mate Tony Giddens at the time, who revealed to me that he'd only recently become aware of such things as the electricity grid that makes the flow of energy possible. So in terms of future trends, and I've been trying to tell him about these things for 30 years, so I thought this was a good measure of the fact that I think our engagement with scientists and the public over issues as the environment and genomics is really having a huge influence, and I'm sure it will continue to do so. I think there's other areas where we could have a lot more influence, and I'll come back to this. But just to return to John's essay, one other issue he considers at length is that of appropriate methods, which Karen has already mentioned, how we actually do STS and the centrality for us of the case study. And I was particularly struck by this, as there's currently much hand-wringing in British sociology over the adequacy of traditional methodologies. There's an essay that's much discussed by Mike Savage and Roger Burrows entitled The Coming Crisis of Empirical Sociology, which argues that large-scale sample surveys and in-depth interviews are increasingly outdated modes, and so we're in a real crisis. We don't know how to do our empirical sociology anymore. And I think what's interesting is how both STS and sociology endlessly do fetishise particular methods as somehow defining our projects. Now, both essays share a critical perspective on how methods are themselves knowledge-making practices and not simply techniques of investigating the separately constituted out there social world. That's fine, but it still leaves open the issue of how we do our work. And John, in a fairly typical STS manner, if you don't mind me saying so, ends his essay by being very critical of questionnaires, saying that they try to enact a world that is neat and tidy, to quote, an order that is epistemologically mistaken, ontologically unrealistic, and politically obnoxious. Now, this did provoke me, as I've personally spent the last few years doing nationally representative surveys of mobile phone users in Australia. And the sociologists, on the other hand, having written what they think is a very controversial essay, end up just saying, oh, let's go for a radical mixture of methods, you know. I mean, I must say I've always been one for going for mixed methods. I think there are real limitations to quantitative and qualitative methods. I've always known that. They are hopelessly inadequate, but that we do what we can, and the more we use, the better shot we're going to have at something approximating a form of knowledge. But I'm also certainly open to developing new techniques, and I thought it was interesting that Karen mentioned that. In my own work on mobile phones, I've used time diaries, I've thought up new ways of using the data that's on mobile phones, and I think there are a lot of exciting new initiatives. I know the time, I time my things, and I know I'm not over time. And when so I've only got another 2 minutes. He's not going to intimidate me. And when I last saw Bruno, I have to say, visited the LSE, all he could talk about was web-based tools that ease social science and these wonderful new techniques that were going to enable us to measure networks and map them in a way we never could before. And I noticed and was very pleased, I'm sorry I couldn't make it, but I noticed there was a session here on quantitative applications of actor network theory, which I think is great. So while I agree with John that we do need to develop new methods for knowing and enacting non-coherence, I don't see that this entails junking quantitative methods. All right, I shall try and skip on. Just the last thing that I've always said about case study methods, but just to reiterate it, because I was hoping to provoke some comments from people. I mean, I have written, as lots of other people have written, about the dangers, really, of case study methods in terms of the way it creates problems for identifying structural and institutionalised gender, race and class relations. And I know that when I say these sort of things, lots of people in the audience sigh and think, here we go again, reifying structure, well known Judith for this. Well, I just wanted to say this because if people want to respond in that manner, I hope they will. I was going to mention very quickly a couple of areas where I think we could have a lot more influence. One is work and employment. And I think although there's been a lot of work on finance, there hasn't really been that much work yet on kind of management and organisations, and I think we could do a lot more there. And the other area is media and communications. And again, there's a very nice essay in the handbook by Pablo Bukowski and Leah Levro, where they talk about the fact that it's only in the last 10 years, really, that there's been a lot of engagement between these areas. And I'm hoping there'll be much more engagement between them, and I'm particularly hoping that Japan will be a very good occasion, given the location of Japan and you know, the amazing work that's researched there on mobile phones and the internet and such like, that this can be one of our major themes for next year. So they're just some of the areas I was thinking about. I'm looking forward to your responses. I know from years of experience that people are already beginning to think about their outfits for the banquet. I've been considering Mike's plea that we dress up for Halloween, but as a feminist working in STS, well, I really thought donning a witch's outfit might just be stating the obvious. But I couldn't resist the hat, as you will see. And just finally, thinking about witches, it did remind me of the important role of witches for the emergence of the women's health movement and feminist analyses of medical technology and expertise. And I'm sure some of you will remember that fantastic pamphlet in 1976 called Witches, Midwives and Nurses by Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English, where they actually chart the long history of women healers and the rise of men in the medical profession. So while I can't pretend to have magical powers, I will enjoy making mischief with you all in 4S over the next 2 years. And I was at this point going to flash up my cartoon, but all the people I've asked to help me with this have failed. Where is it? So thank you very much.
I'm very convinced that this society will be in good hands with forceful and strong leadership for the next 2 years. Okay.